Last week, when Prime Minister Mark Carney and Alberta Premier Danielle Smith announced the Alberta-Canada Pipeline MOU, BC Premier David Eby was not very happy, and he held a press conference later that day. And in it, he asked a question I get asked all the time, and I thought I'd provide you some answers. So the question is, and this is a quote from him, why is BC importing oil and gas from the US? Could we increase refining capacity and have a win for everybody here? The short answer is no. But I get asked this question, but why don't we do that more in Alberta? Why don't we do it more in Eastern Canada, Quebec and Ontario in particular? And so what I did is I went out and I found a resource from the U.S. Energy Information Administration, which is, like a gold-plated resource of energy data and analysis. And it's called Outlook on Global Refining to 2028. And it was published just over a year ago. So it's fairly current. I mean, it's not like the refining industry moves in a hurry. So I'm going to give you five things, five reasons why we're not going to be building or expanding refineries in Canada. So the first one is the demand is not here. The growing demand is in Asia and the Middle East. So give you an example, according to the EIA, over the next, so by 2028, there'll be 2.6 to 4.9 million barrels a day of new refining capacity that'll come on stream in China, India, and the Middle East. That's in what it calls the Pacific Basin. And it's going to see 11.6% demand growth in terms of gasoline and diesel. So it makes perfect sense. And that's from 2022 to 2028, the 11.6%. In the Atlantic Basin, which is defined as the Americas, Europe, and Africa, it's only going to grow 1.6% during that period. So about zero point 0.6 of a million barrels a day, which is essentially stagnant. So all of the demand is growing in the Middle East, and the industry goes where the demand goes. That's where they're going to invest their capital, not in stagnant markets. Here's another thing. The old style of refinery, where it was a standalone, it produced diesel and it produced gasoline and produced some other kinds of products, but mainly petrochemicals were separate. But that's not the case anymore. Particularly, I think China pioneered the crude to chemical process, and Saudi Arabia is coming up with its own. But the idea is you have a refinery and petrochemical complex, and then you can switch back and forth between fuels and petrochemicals depending on what the market wants, the time of year, and so on. And you can use a lot more of the barrel. It's efficient. It's lower costs, and so these are huge, massive complexes. The ones in China, I think, are between 400,000 and 800,000 barrels a day. Those are very big refining petrochemical complexes. And so they're designed around plastics and chemical feedstock demand, not gasoline and diesel markets. And essentially, here's an interesting point that the EIA made. It undermines the economics of new conventional refineries in mature markets like Canada. Because, obviously Canada is a mature market and nobody wants to invest in the status quo. They want growth, and all the growth is in refineries plus petrochemicals. That's where they're going to put their money. Okay, that was the second one. Here's point number three. Canada's upstream growth is being pulled into the Asian demand centers, not domestic refining. This is why we see the arguments out of Alberta for this 1 million barrel a day pipeline from Edmonton to Prince Rupert, and an expansion of the Trans Mountain Expansion Pipeline, which goes from out to Burnaby. The TMX is because that's where the demand is growing, and so they want to take more of that. So the production is going to grow in Canada, the U.S., Brazil, and Guyana to supply that new demand, but they're not paying any attention to Canada. And trade flows are shifting toward exporting crude westward, not refining it domestically. And one of the things I've learned about the oil and gas industry is that once it's set on a path, it's very difficult to do something. It takes a major shift in markets or technology or policy in order to get it to bump it off the status quo. As I'm fond of saying, the oil and gas industry innovates really well inside the box. It does not innovate well outside the box. And essentially, putting more money into old refineries would be, in this context, out of the box thinking, and it's not going to happen. Okay, so in growth markets, even in those growth markets, refining projects face delays, cost overruns, and closure risks. And so, if as bad as they are in the growth markets, um, the perception is that they would be even worse in the mature markets. And here's one of the things we know. Like if you look at the U.S. market, their gasoline demand peaked, I think in like 2017, and has been on a slow decline ever since. And you're seeing there's a small refinery in Texas that's just recently closed. There's a refinery or two in California that's closed. I mean, some of them have converted from oil and diesel to biodiesel. So what you're seeing is a consolidating market and a ultimately a shrinking market, and we haven't even got to peak oil demand yet, and that is number five. Because if you were looking at a refinery and you were saying, well, okay, if I'm going to invest in, say, $1 billion in upgrading my refinery, I need what, 20, 25 years of returns to pay for that upgrade. And I'm reading the International Energy Agency, which says even in the STEPS scenario, which is business as usual, oil demand peaks in 2030. And the only scenario now is a new one, the current policy scenario, which is being dissed left and right for the assumptions behind it are just not defensible. Doesn't matter what you do, never mind the headlines, read the experts. They don't think the CPS is likely at all. I would say it's 75-25. We're going to see peak oil demand by 2030, if not sooner. Why would you invest in a refinery if you think that the demand for oil is going to be declining? And look at the what's going on in China. China is driving the electrification of transportation, so that's the light duty. But it's also driving now the electrification of the medium duty, like delivery vans and garbage trucks and what have you. And it's begun to electrify heavy duty, which is best example is long haul freight, the Class 8 trucks that you see running around on the highways. And so that is the trend. And why would you invest in a 20, 25-year asset that where the trends are going in the opposite direction? This is the argument we make about, building a new pipeline to start with, but it certainly applies to refineries. And all of this information jibes with a report that came out in 2017 by IHS Markit, as now it's S&P Global. And it was written by an economist that I've interviewed many times, Kevin Byrne. And it said all of this stuff then, and nothing's changed. More refineries have closed, and demand for gasoline has fallen even further. But the basics economics, that report said very clearly that new refineries, uneconomic. Full upgrading of Alberta's heavy crude, uneconomic. Doesn't make any sense. That's why you haven't seen any new upgraders built. The only thing that made sense was taking that ultra heavy sour crude and upgrading it to a heavy crude or a medium crude that would flow in a pipeline without any diluent. And if you're not aware, the bitumen that comes out of the oil sands is so thick, it's like peanut butter. So if you want it to flow in a pipeline, you've got to thin it out with some kind of a light hydrocarbon, almost like a Varsol or something like that. And that actually made economic sense. And we're not even talking about partial upgrading. That the Alberta government canceled its program in 2019, and nobody even talks about it anymore. But if you eliminated the diluent, which is 30% of the dilbit, then you could get more actual oil that had value in the pipeline. So the chances of increasing capacity or building new refineries in Western Canada is zero. And we haven't even talked about the Sturgeon refinery, the Northwest refinery in Alberta that's had all sorts of financial problems. Finally kicked off. I think it's up and running now over the last year or two, but over budget, over schedule, and so on. So and that I think had been the first refinery that got built in 30 years. So bottom line is there is no appetite whatsoever to invest in new refineries or expanded refineries in a mature market like Canada.